Before millions of viewers learned the heartbreaking truth, they only knew her as the cheerful little girl who seemed to light up every scene she appeared in. But behind the laughter, behind the fame, and behind one of television's most beloved family shows, there was a very different reality unfolding. Years later, details from her life would reveal struggles few fans ever imagined. Stay until the end because the story becomes far more complicated than most people realize, and you'll understand why people are still talking about her decades later. For audiences watching Family Affair in the late 1960s, Anissa Jones looked like the definition of childhood happiness. Playing Buffy Davis, the youngest member of the fictional family, she quickly became one of the most recognizable child stars in America. Her famous catchphrases and natural charm helped turn the series into a major success. But fame arrived incredibly early. Anissa was only a young child when she entered Hollywood. According to reports from the time, producers immediately recognized something special about her ability to connect with viewers. While many children struggled under studio lights and demanding schedules, Anissa appeared comfortable and confident. That image helped create the impression that everything in her life was perfect. In reality, life behind the scenes was much more complicated. Her parents divorced while she was still young. Sources suggest the separation created instability during important years of her childhood. At the same time, her acting career kept growing, bringing both opportunities and enormous expectations. Like many young performers of that era, she had to balance school, work, public attention, and family problems all at once. Former child actors have often spoken about how difficult that balance can be. In later interviews, many stars from similar generations described feeling isolated because their lives looked so different from those of ordinary children. Instead of playgrounds and birthday parties, they spent long hours on sets surrounded by adults. For Anissa, success came with another challenge. As Family Affair became more popular, audiences began identifying her almost entirely with the character Buffy. While that fame brought admiration, it also made it difficult for her to grow beyond the role. According to entertainment historians, many child stars from that period struggled to transition into normal teenage lives after becoming household names at such a young age. And when the series eventually ended, everything changed. The routines she had known for years suddenly disappeared. The attention faded. The structure provided by television production vanished. What remained was a teenager trying to figure out who she really was outside the character millions remembered. Many fans never realized how difficult that adjustment could be. Looking back now, people often wonder whether warning signs were already present long before tragedy struck. Some believe the pressures placed on young celebrities were underestimated during that era. Here's something worth thinking about. Do you think Hollywood has become better at protecting child stars, or do many of the same problems still exist today? Share your thoughts in the comments because different generations often see this issue very differently. At the time, however, most viewers simply remembered the smiling little girl on television. They had no idea that years later, painful truths about loneliness, pressure, and life after fame would begin to emerge. What made Anissa Jones's story especially tragic wasn't just what happened at the end of her life. It was the fact that many people later realized the signs had been there all along. After Family Affair ended in 1971, Anissa was entering her teenage years while carrying a level of fame that most adults would struggle to manage. The role that made her famous had also placed her inside a box. Casting directors still saw Buffy. Fans still saw Buffy. But Anissa herself was trying to discover who she really was. Friends and people close to her later described a young woman who wanted independence. She no longer wanted to be remembered only as a television child. According to various reports and interviews conducted years later, she hoped to build a normal life away from the spotlight. That proved harder than expected. Unlike today's young celebrities, former child stars in the 1970s had very few support systems. Conversations about mental health were rare. Counseling for young performers wasn't common. Once the cameras stopped rolling, many actors were expected to simply move on. In Anissa's case, the transition became increasingly difficult. Sources suggest she struggled with feelings of loneliness and uncertainty. The attention she once received had faded, and like many former child actors, she faced the confusing experience of growing up in public while also feeling forgotten. Years later, entertainment experts would point to stories like hers as examples of how sudden fame can affect a child's development. Several studies on former child performers have shown that identity struggles and emotional pressure are common challenges after early success. Looking back at old interviews and photographs, some fans now believe there were quiet warnings hidden in plain sight. Not dramatic warnings. Not shocking confessions. Just small moments. Moments where a teenager seemed to be searching for stability, while the world still expected her to remain the adorable little girl from television. Sadly, few people recognized those struggles at the time. As the years passed, Anissa began spending time with older crowds and seeking freedom from the image Hollywood had created for her. People close to her later recalled that she desperately wanted control over her own life. But with that freedom came influences that worried some family members. And this is where her story starts taking a much darker turn. Because before tragedy struck, Anissa reportedly opened up about frustrations that many former child stars would later describe themselves. She spoke about pressure, about expectations, about feeling trapped by an identity she had never chosen. Right in the middle of all this, something remarkable happened. Decades after her death, audiences are still discovering her story and asking difficult questions about fame and childhood. That says a lot about how powerful these conversations remain. If you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind Hollywood's biggest names and want more thoughtful investigations like this, consider subscribing. Some of the most fascinating stories are often the ones hidden behind familiar faces. What Anissa would eventually reveal, and what people close to her later shared, painted a picture far different from the happy world viewers remembered from Family Affair. The version of Anissa Jones that millions remembered was frozen in time. To television audiences, she would always be little Buffy from Family Affair. But the real Anissa had grown up, and according to people who knew her, she was carrying emotional burdens that few outsiders understood. In conversations with friends during her later teenage years, reports suggest she expressed frustration with the life fame had created. She wanted people to see her as a normal person, not as a former child star. Some accounts described her feeling disconnected from the image the public continued to celebrate. That feeling wasn't unique to her. Many former child actors have since spoken openly about similar experiences. Years after Anissa's death, stars from different generations revealed how difficult it can be when childhood success becomes your entire identity. Psychologists who study fame have explained that growing up under constant public attention can interfere with normal emotional development and make the transition into adulthood especially challenging. For Anissa, those struggles unfolded during a period when very little support existed for young performers. According to reports from people close to the family, tensions sometimes developed over questions of independence and the direction of her life. Like many teenagers, she wanted freedom. But unlike most teenagers, she was doing so after spending years as a national television icon. Some friends later recalled hearing her talk about feeling misunderstood. Others described someone searching for happiness while trying to escape the expectations attached to her past. Those personal struggles became even more painful because they remained largely invisible to the public. Then, in August 1976, tragedy struck. Anissa Jones died at just 18 years old. News of her death shocked fans across the country. Authorities determined that the cause was an accidental drug overdose. Suddenly, the little girl who had once represented innocence and family entertainment became the center of heartbreaking headlines. The contrast stunned people. Many viewers who grew up watching Family Affair found it difficult to reconcile the image they remembered with the reality that had unfolded. And as more details emerged, conversations began shifting away from simple shock toward larger questions about the pressures faced by young celebrities. Her death became part of a broader discussion that continues even today. Stories involving former child stars have repeatedly forced Hollywood and audiences alike to confront uncomfortable truths. Fame can provide incredible opportunities, but it can also create pressures that children are often not prepared to handle. And perhaps that is the most painful truth Anissa's story revealed. Sometimes the people who appear happiest on screen are fighting battles nobody can see. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone you thought was doing fine was actually struggling in silence? Stories like this remind us how important compassion can be because we rarely know what another person is carrying. In the years following her death, her story continued to influence conversations about child actors, emotional well-being, and the hidden costs of fame. But perhaps the most surprising part of her legacy wasn't the tragedy itself. It was what happened afterward. People who had never met Anissa Jones continued discovering her story generation after generation, keeping her memory alive in ways nobody could have predicted. And that lasting impact says something powerful about the lives we remember and the lessons we still haven't fully learned. For decades after her death, Anissa Jones remained much more than a former television star. Her story slowly transformed into a cautionary tale about childhood fame, emotional pressure, and the responsibility adults have toward young performers. When Family Affair first aired, conversations about mental health were very different from what they are today. Few people discussed anxiety, identity struggles, or the emotional effects of growing up in front of millions. In many ways, child stars were expected to succeed, smile, and simply adapt. But stories like Anissa's forced people to look deeper. Over the years, other famous former child actors shared experiences that sounded surprisingly familiar. Some described losing their sense of identity. Others spoke about loneliness, pressure, or the difficulty of separating themselves from characters that audiences refuse to forget. According to industry experts and biographers, these patterns helped create new discussions about the treatment of young entertainers. While Hollywood still faces criticism today, support systems for child performers have become far more developed than they were during Anissa's era. Yet many people believe the industry still has lessons left to learn. That's one reason Anissa's story continues connecting with viewers who were born long after Family Affair disappeared from television. Her life raises questions that go beyond Hollywood. How much pressure should society place on children? What happens when success arrives before emotional maturity? And are we paying enough attention to the people behind the public image? Those questions resonate because they apply to everyday life as well. Not everyone experiences fame, but many people understand what it feels like to carry expectations, hide struggles, or feel trapped by how others see them. If you've ever felt misunderstood, pressured to live up to an image, or worried about disappointing others, you're not alone. That's probably why stories like Anissa's remain so emotional even after all these years. Perhaps her greatest legacy isn't the tragedy. Perhaps it's the conversation. A conversation about compassion, about protecting young people, about recognizing that success and happiness are not always the same thing. And despite the sadness surrounding her final years, millions still remember the joy she brought to audiences, the laughter, the innocence, the moments that made families gather around their televisions and smile. In that sense, Anissa Jones left behind two stories. The story everyone saw, and the story people only began to understand later. Even now, nearly half a century after her passing, new generations continue discovering her life and asking the same difficult questions. Maybe that's why her memory refuses to fade. Because some stories don't end when a person is gone. They continue every time someone pauses and wonders whether we've truly learned from the past. And perhaps the answer to that question is still being written.